Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this session where we're going to be talking about global cooperation. And we have a panel of distinguished leaders from think tanks all around the world. I'd like to commend my colleague Paul Sampson for this idea to bring thought leaders from around the world together to talk about what global cooperation means at this moment. I would say there's some real challenges. When I think of the trend lines around global cooperation, there's worrying trends. The first that strikes me is that political tribalism is the worst I've ever seen it in my entire life. And so now we've created a set of perverse incentives where the identity of the speaker matters more than what they say. And so if a Republican or someone on the right side of the political spectrum were to find the cure for cancer, the left side would disagree with them. If the left were to find a way to establish peace and harmony, the right side would disagree with them. And so that's a world that we're going into, and it's not unique to the G7 countries, though it is certainly pronounced. I'd also say that we're looking at a moment in time where people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, and this is not just unique to the public. I think this is within the policy community generally. While the challenges that we're being asked to address are getting more and more complicated, so shorter attention spans, less capacity, harder challenges. The other trend line that worries me is that we still structure ourselves in silos. We still have departments of X or departments of Y, but as I think the first panel made abundantly clear, these are horizontally integrated public policy challenges. If you can tell me where technology development, national security, intellectual property, economics, and trade start and stop, I'll buy lunch. It's all, as far as I can tell, part of the same bowl of spaghetti. And then finally, the pace of change is just absolutely frenetic. Artificial intelligence is upending just about every system we can imagine. So we've got complicated challenges and we've got capacity problems. At a time when cooperation is at relatively an all-time low, the problems that we're facing require cooperation or they will remain unsolved. And so this is what I want to turn to this distinguished panel of think tank leaders to discuss. So our first speaker is Tetsushi Sonobe. He's recently outgoing Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Sir, over to you for your first intervention.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, so it's really an honor to start the discussion. So this year we have already seen the numerous natural disasters like earthquakes, wildfires, floods, tropical cyclones. And many countries are at war, including Ukraine, Palestine, Myanmar, Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, Burkina Faso, and so on. And we have seen the tariff wars, trade wars, and the related policy uncertainties surging. So these things are making the world economy shrink. And also friendship, trust, solidarity, and cooperation among countries have been declining. So this in this very difficult times, track two efforts are very important. So that's why assuming these things are, making this track two efforts assume greater and greater importance during these difficult, challenging times. So I'd like to pay my deepest respect to the leaders of the think tanks, contributing to the formation of domestic and foreign policies, shaping public opinion, the striving to prevent setbacks in international coordination and cooperation. So I'm particularly humbled by the effort of the chairs and the co-chairs of T7, Canada, and the T20 South Africa. So there are really numerous policy issues and challenges we are facing. And then today's discussion we be very, informative and encouraging to all the people making this kind of efforts. So I'm just finished my tenure at ADB Institute, 5 years tenure, and I'm from today. I'm a university college teacher again. So I really like to listen to my think tank colleagues. So I stop here. So
Wonderful.
thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, and thank you very much for those interventions. Really appreciate it. There's maybe two things that you said that I'd want to just pause on for a moment. The first is this importance of track two diplomacy. I think there's really something to that, because when you have a track two process, so just for the benefit of the audience, track one is formal, official to official dialogue. Track two is when it's civil society or academic institutions to academic institutions in another country. That creates a level of informality for conversations that does not exist in the track 1.5 world, and so, or the track one world. And so there's really something to be said for that. And the second thing is, welcome back to the academic world. I think you will notice that student essays have gotten a lot better since ChatGPT. So look out for that. Okay, our next speaker is Bambang Brodjonegoro, who is now the incoming dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, especially to the chair of the Seven Canada for inviting me in this important event. Let me focus on the issue of the trade war, because I believe everybody now is talking about what will be the impact of the trade war, especially between US and several countries to the global economy. I think think tanks around the world should focus on the kind of observation or analysis whether we are going to move toward the new regime of global trade. Few years ago, not long ago, we were very excited with the globalization, and then followed by the formation of WTO, trying to regulate the free trade. And free trade basically is the one that really adopted by everybody, not only developed economy but also developing economy. But today, with the with the trade war or tariff war, then we will have a big question that think tanks should contribute to answer. Are we going to the different regime of the global trade? And is it the one that really now the best interest, not only for developed economy, but also developing economy? I think this is very important question to be at least analyzed before we can come up with the conclusive answer. And then I like to make the connection between the issue of the trade war and the issue of the AI that you mentioned, basically the digitalization of the economy. In my observation, digitalization, including AI, will lead to the kind of domination of very few countries in the world. So with this kind of domination, it might be conflicting with the idea of the free trade. So I'm afraid that we need to dig deeper into the impact of the AI and digitalization to the possible new regime of global trade. That would be my first intervention. And then on the second related issue, since we are now moving away for the so-called global multilateralism, maybe think tank around the world can start thinking, if global multilateralism may be out of our hand, could regional multilateralism be alternative solution? Because sometimes if the global scheme doesn't work well, regional could help to some extent. At least in our part of the world, in Asia, some regional cooperation could come up with sometimes better result than more multilateralism cooperation. So I think I will stop my intervention here, and also I would like to say hi to everybody, because in 2 weeks I will be the new dean of ADBI, and of course very successful Dean Sonobe. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. And I'd like to commend the panelists for sticking to time. This is really quite remarkable. So thank you for that. I want maybe to pause on one thing that you said, which I think we'll draw out in other interventions, is this relationship between trade, digitalization, intellectual property. Because normally when you think about trade, you think, well, hey, look, I'll grow corn and I'm really good at growing corn, and you grow wheat and you're really good at growing wheat, and then we'll trade and we're all better off for it. But intellectual property doesn't work that way, right? It's by definition exclusionary. It's the creation of artificial legal monopolies, and we're hooking everything we possibly can up to the internet. And so trade, technology, and intellectual property are now linked in ways that we didn't even think of, 10 or 20 years ago. So this is a fundamentally different world. So thank you for drawing that point out, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation in your new role. Next up, we've got Luciana Mendes Santos Servo, who is the president for the Institute for Applied Economic Research. Over to you.
Thank you for the invitation to this T7 midterm conference and discussing some of the things that I think are quite important for us to go on in cooperation. I will focus on one side of the cooperation in this geopolitical difficult moments that we're having. There is the collaboration between think tanks. On the ongoing collaboration during the T20, I have seen spaces for dialogue, not only in T20, but with T7 as an important space to build trust as we cooperate in producing knowledge and evidence-informed policies, and also advocacy. I don't think we should have it for granted, because these platforms bring different countries, different institutions with different views, and even though we can build consensus in this process. So as we can build consensus in a process with these different views, we can also collaborate to build consensus in other processes that are quite difficult right now. Looking at T7 key policy areas, there is many convergence with the ones that are going and being discussed for a long time in T20. And I highlight this convergence with T20 during the Brazilian presidency, for example. For sure, we are discussing the topics of AI, digital transformation, environment, energy, and sustainable finance. What we brought, that is what you want to emphasize, that is also a challenge, is to think about inclusive digital transformation. So it's not only the questions of regulation and thinking about the ethics of the AI, this is quite important, but also thinking about how to include the ones that are not included in this digital world, and then doesn't dominate and have the capacity to build upon this digital transformation and this AI revolution. So thinking about this is a challenging, but a challenge that we can go as think tanks and thinking about actionable recommendations for this process. There is also another area that is how we are going on digital and energy transition and climate change. There is a lot of convergence, but a lot of challenges also to think about which policies can be a win-win for developing countries and also for developed countries. So I think there are challenges, but there are many opportunities for us as think tanks to build trust and go on in this process of building actionable recommendation in this geopolitical crisis that we're living on. That's my initial remarks.
Thank you very much for that. And as someone who works at a think tank, I would tend to agree with you, right? There's a huge scope for us to try and help here. And in some ways, we've got the coolest job that there is, right? We get to wake up every day and try and make the world a better place, but all we get is the power of ideas and networks. And so that's, I think, a really fine point that you raised. Also, this idea of making sure that we're thinking of everyone in this transformation, right? Because we don't forget for 1 second, the society we build, this is not happening to us. It's a series of choices and trade-offs. And we have to think about the have-nots in these transitions. Like, we're building structures where there's individuals that are billionaires, maybe someday trillionaires, and how much is enough? How much does one person need? And to the extent that it's required, to what cost, and how do we bring others in the transition, especially in economies that are not as developed? So thank you for making us think about that. Next up, we have Esther Brimmer. She is the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance at CFR, or Council Foreign Relations, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. Over to you.
Hello, it is an honor to be speaking with you today and with colleagues from around the world. I'd like to thank CIGI for bringing us together, and I agree with those who've already spoken about the importance of cooperation amongst think tanks and the ability to talk together about the challenges that we face. And I particularly note our colleagues in Canada who will be doing work on, of course, on the G7, hosting the G7 this year, and our colleagues in South Africa who are hosting the G20. It's a busy year for you, and I wish you all the best on these important activities. I thought that I'd raise some slightly different issues. That I would also say that one of the things we do as think tanks is look out across our international scene and see where we need to make sure that we are acting and looking ahead. And so I would flag what I call repair the old and build the new. And I'll mention two areas that are actually fundamental. One we haven't had to deal with in a long time, but I just note that it is 2025. And looking ahead, one of the things that will be on the international agenda, particularly agenda for the United States and the Russian Federation, is arms control. Now, with over the past 3 decades, with the end of the Cold War, we haven't had to think as much about nuclear weapons control. But one of the issues is that the New START Treaty, which came into effect in 2011, expires. It had been extended. Of course, Russia had actually notified the U.S. of its suspension in 2023 as well, related to the Ukraine issues. But it is important that these two countries come up with a new, updated framework on the New START Treaty. So I flagged that while when we're thinking about areas where we need cooperation, we need that process to actually work and make sure that there is a framework. It's the only remaining bilateral framework managing the most dangerous weapons on Earth. So I acknowledge the responsibility and challenge of addressing that in the coming year. The second area I would say in terms of making sure we repair the old is global health. That, as we all know, unfortunately, the United States has, under this administration, has put forward a declaration that the United States is planning to depart the World Health Organization. Global health is one of the most fundamental aspects of our shared human entity. And so the United States provides 16% of the World Health Organization budget. It's seconded staff to WHO for years, and it's made voluntary contributions in various ways. Managing and trying to hold together the global health system, I think, is an area of extreme importance, and one where there'll need to be cooperation among its governments, but also amongst non-state actors as well. So those are two areas which I think the management of arms control and the management of global health are, again, fundamental to our world, and we'll need to work together on those. What I think particularly interesting for the G7 and the G20 is building the new. And here I would say, I'd like to say that one of the places where we need cooperation is in the management of spaces beyond national jurisdiction. That includes the oceans, that includes Antarctica, but I will flag outer space. Because at the moment, over 90 countries have something in space, whether it's a satellite that's monitoring weather patterns, that daily life, including probably this very technology we're on, all requires some form of use of space assets. But there is, of course, the challenge of busier and busier skies, the threats also to satellites as well, but we need them, and we need both the United States and China to be talking about trying to manage space, and we need all countries to be part of creating sets of rules that make us possible to use these extraordinary technologies on a daily basis. I will note that, of course, the G20 has its space economy leaders meeting, and the G7 years in the past has talked about the importance of managing space debris. The access to space is something that is helping out people around the globe, from, access to the internet, to agricultural information, to weather information, to health information. And I think one of the things that the G7 and G20 processes, along with other processes, for example, parts of the United Nations system, can all help in trying to secure these assets and make these connections possible so that everyone on the planet can benefit from the technology of the modern world. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. And maybe I'll pick up a thread that I think was underneath your last comment about space. This is an area where our geostrategic long-term interests are aligned. It requires cooperation. I mean, it is literally the commons, and what happens to one affects others. And at the same time, to the point raised earlier about digitalization, we're hooking every aspect of our economy up to the internet that we possibly can. The other day I was in the store and I saw a toothbrush that you hook up to the internet. Why you would ever need to hook a toothbrush up to the internet, I don't know. But the point is that connectivity is going to be more and more enabled by satellites. And so there are areas of that are pushing convergence and require cooperation, because if not, they quite literally call it a tragedy of the commons. So thank you very much for those very fine comments. Next up, we have Christian Kastrop, who is the CEO and partner, Global Solutions Initiative. Christian, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just joined the first panel here in Waterloo, and I came out of that panel a little bit, say, with a rather gloomy impression. So that really it's all about security and it's all about confrontation. Who will win the war about global resources, and who will have the best IT and technology also will be a winner. So global cooperation right now on several regions of the world looks a little bit on the downside. And I think this is where I would make the pitch also for the think tank community, also delivering proposals. And so there's really a very urgent need to rebuild and to re-stabilize international cooperation. I think the think tanks and accompanying institutions could really do that. So we have still the issue of climate breakdown, mounting debt, rising inequalities, geopolitical fragmentation, as said, G20, G7. I think the broader multilateral system really needs a new, consistent and high quality and globally coordinated policy advice. And of course, I would not be too long here, but of course, if we also look at the 80 years old Bretton Woods system, the global governance, which is still tilted to the North and the West, is indeed becoming more and more of a problem. So I think time for advocacy in a way is over. I think we need to do coordinated and quick action with the think tanks here, also here at the table. So my fellow speakers are part of that community here. So, and I very much would like to value also the cooperation effort led by the ADBI, but there has some others have already said that. I would really think that this, say, active members of the T20 and the G7 are really to ensuring these actions also in a way science-driven. So we must acknowledge our efforts so far, also for this community, have been rather fragmented, transient and limited. So a more permanent and I think collaborative platform to sustain think tank engagement and knowledge sharing with the political community, with the civil society, and also with the business environment, I think is really important. So we really should also to build up. So we do have the scientific input, but we need how to make it work and not stick in these issues more on a, say, very general level. So I think, and of course, this is why I think this multi-stakeholder idea that we have to talk to the outside in a way that is understandable also by the general public is so important. Mentioned already that track 2 is really a very important thing. So we need really a facilitating body for global think tank cooperation. We should connect leading emerging institutions worldwide to deliver that. So I think this approach is designed as additional support. So on top of the official processes, again, this is the rule of track 2. So, and we should really try to provide trusted evidence-based mechanisms, ideas, and scientific results to really create a consistent knowledge repository about presidencies. And we would also like to support the process between the presidencies. I think if this mechanism will also fail, whether it's in the G7 or whether in the G20, I think this would really be, from my point of view, a disaster. I stop here. I hope it was not too gloomy, but I think we could really scale up our efforts as think tanks, as multipliers, delivering good ideas.
Thank you, Christian. No, not too gloomy. I would say just gloomy enough. I mean, it's nice to have some like a realistic perspective. But the one thing that you raised was the role of the private sector in all of this too, and I think that that's really important because this is we talk about policy, but it's not for governments, it's a governance. And so it's an ecosystem of the private sector, of government, to be sure, civil society, academics, and all the rest of it, and the public. And we're all part of this together. So I think that that's really important. And maybe just to tie the previous speaker's thoughts to yours, if you look at space as a part of this, if you look at the number of satellites launched in the last 5 years, it is more than the combined total of human history in every year before it. And guess who's launching most of them? SpaceX. I was in a meeting with the Russians, and they were hammering their fist on the desk like it matters. Where most of the tech is in private hands now. The role of the state in this area is shrinking, and so it's a good point to make sure that we're thinking about the private sector as a discrete actor in this governance challenge. So next up, we've got Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs and a longtime collaborator with CIGI. Elizabeth, nice to see you. Over to you.
Great to see you too, Aaron, and good to be with you all. So we're the sister think tank to your T7 this year, and we wish you all the very best over the course of the year. I think I'm probably going to echo some of the comments that have already been made, and sort of start by saying that it's critical to lessen divisions and polarizations because, of course, these are the foundations or the obstacles to meaningful international cooperation. And I want to start with that because I think we need to reflect that apart from what has happened in recent months in North America, which has seen an even more accelerated fragmentation and division. It's become much more intense. This is not a new development, okay? We've had fragmentation in the past, and certainly I think in the last 3 years, sort of sitting here in South Africa, in the last 3 years, I think we can say that the world has increasingly been characterized by divisions between global north and global south. I know these terms are contested, but if you look at the way in which different parts of the world have engaged on the war in Ukraine, in Gaza and Palestine, and of course even before that around the COVID pandemic and the perceptions that many developing countries had that there wasn't sufficient solidarity. So this has been building up. And international cooperation at the end of the day is ultimately about really building up consensus. And we were having a conversation with the T20 Advisory Council yesterday. And one of the points that came up is, the way we understand consensus has to change. We're not quite sure how and what that necessarily entails. But one of the key issues around consensus, particularly when you're talking about it in the context of G20 and G7, is that, we focus on consensus around text. And we spend a lot of time sort of navigating text and square brackets and things like that. And that actually what is much more important is to really be able to build some consensus around driving actual deliverables. And here I want to maybe just highlight a couple of points where progress on some of these issues, both this year and beyond, would be able to address some of the trust deficit and foster international cooperation. And I say that sort of sitting here in South Africa, immersed in many of these conversations around how the world is perceived, and reflecting also on some of the priorities that South Africa has identified. The first is on international financial architecture reform. And I'm going to break that down. Here, of course, we can talk about transformational reform. It's what Esther was referring about to, building new rather than just repairing the old. But I think in the current context, repairing the old itself is a positive step forward. And some specific examples in that regard, which are already on the table, but where it would be really critical to see progress, would be something, for example, like the special drawing rights, the ability to rechannel them to African to various regional development banks, such as the African Development Bank. It would be to deal with some aspects of the debt challenge that many developing countries, and particularly in Africa, face, which is how do you ideas to reform the common framework on debt treatment. And one of the ideas on the table is really to also make it a little bit more expansive to incorporate middle income countries. It's really taking forward decisions that have preceded this year by other previous G20 presidencies around multilateral development bank reform and specific things around tripling lending capacity without necessarily increasing capital. That ties in again with the discussions that I think are so critical for developing economies, which is we're 5 years away from the Sustainable Development Goals, from Agenda 2033 and 2030. I'm thinking of 2063. Sorry, that's the African agenda. But we're 5 years away from that. And a lot of the issues in terms of attaining the SDGs relate to finance, but also they intersect with climate, particularly with health issues, with the initiative, for example, that the Brazilians took around hunger and poverty. And the element that sort of provides a shadow in this conversation is, of course, the fact that ODA, as we know it, is probably increasingly largely off the table, both in terms of size, but also in terms of the way in which it has been executed. And so, how do we ensure that at the global level, we don't undercut the key developmental priorities that are so important for developing countries and which also help to build up trust going forward between North and South? How do we ensure that those are not seriously compromised? And there are a couple of issues on the table already during the South African presidency, for example, around illicit financial flows, really unpacking the issues of the cost of capital, issues of more fair, equitable taxation system, and so on. We recognize that these are unlikely to happen or to be driven to have significant outcomes over the next year, because I think of the geopolitical environment. But it is important at the track too, as has been mentioned, that we continue to have those conversations, and also to make sure that where we can build consensus in groups, that we do that. So our key challenge is how does the rest of the world, if there are some who do not wish to cooperate at this point, how do we ensure that the rest of the world, that the processes move forward and that we can show that they're not ineffective or useless? Because I think that's another dimension that we mustn't forget about in terms of international cooperation, the sense sometimes that we feel we're sort of on a hamster wheel and actions are not really being driven forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And really what I'm hearing you say is we need results, right? We've been having these types of conversations for a long time, and we're a long way off from the SDGs. 5 years is going to go by like that, and so I think the real kernel of what you've said is that statements are fine and productive conversations are all well and good, but we actually have to make a difference now in people's lives. So thank you for that. That challenge, really. Next up, we have Anna-Katharina Hornidge, who is the director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Over to you.
Yeah, hi, everybody. It's a real honor to be with you here today. And I think I want to hook up on what, Aaron, you mentioned at the beginning, political tribalism. And that's, of course, an assessment that also resonates in some of the discussions in Germany. And I would like to simply sort of give an insight into some of the discussions here, while probably being even more interested in how these discussions are viewed from afar, from your continents, basically. But yeah, the might over right tendencies that we see unfold have led, as many of you know, also in the German context now, to the security debates, defense debates being lifted up top priority at the level of top priority. We have seen a decision being taken by the still German government in place to make it possible, constitutionally possible, to go into debt for an extra 500 billion euro in order to invest it into defense. So this is, 80 years after the end of the Second World War, a huge step for a society that has been pacified over the past centuries, and there's no real space actually for a defense and military logic in the collective identity of large parts of German society. Yeah, it is a society that has a civil power, that is an economic power, but that has learned to define itself quite far away from a military self-definition. So this is, and of course turning such a civil power into a society that is able to actually defend itself in a military manner takes, of course, time. Now, while that discussion on investments into defense, building up production capacities for weapons, etc., is ongoing, we also have a coalition government or a coalition agreement being negotiated by the soon-to-become government of Germany. We had our federal election, and there's a coalition government being formed. Right now, we are in the middle of the coalition agreement negotiations. And of course, money is a big topic. And where does that money for the need to defend ourselves come from? Yeah, and then obviously also in Germany, there's a tendency to look around and look at Canada and Great Britain and Australia, all countries that have merged their development ministries and foreign ministries, all countries that have reduced their official development assistance. And Elizabeth, while I agree with your statement that ODA is no longer the channel to mobilize the funds actually needed, it is a dangerous debate at the moment in the German context to sort of use the examples from other countries to also potentially slash the development budget. So what we advise also from a think tank and research institute perspective is to rather shift the perspective on the level of the German policymakers and understand that indeed emancipating yourself militarily speaking takes time. Yeah, it takes time to build up all the capacities. And while that takes time, investments into cooperation and civil conflict prevention is absolutely needed. And of course, civil conflict prevention comes in different forms, but always comes through, or always requires the financing, and traditionally within the German context has been financed through official development assistance. So we are trying to advise quite strongly for understanding that investments in, yes, the multilateral level, even though that is difficult, continues to be of utmost importance for a country that is, it's a rather large liberal democracy in the mid of or in the heart of Europe. But in an international comparison, it is a small country. And it is one of many small countries in the European Union context, which is in the end a collection of many small countries. So to make that being part of the discussions, I think is very important. The realization we indeed depend on partnerships, we indeed depend on a rule-based international order, so on a multilateral level, but also invest into the plurilateral and minilateral formats that exists. So terms such as G20 -2, G7 -1 are terms that are being thrown around here in the German science policy landscape at the moment. Of course, the investment into bilateral partnerships and bilateral partnerships with regional powers or middle powers, but also in countries and with countries that are in the close proximity of the big power centers of the future. So along the borders of some of the centers of power and large countries is another strategy being that we argue for. And at the same time, we have strong tendencies also in the German parties negotiating the coalition agreement to focus in the future far more on self-oriented, self-interested self-interest oriented official development assistance or also cooperation partnerships, and with this focus substantially more on the regions around Europe. So that is also part of the discussion. But what I want to add to the conversation is that ongoing perspective, ongoing happening of the negotiations in the German context. And of course, that leads me to reiterate what many of you have said, the importance of non-state cooperation increases, science cooperation, track 2 diplomacy, all of these forms gain importance. And I would agree, Esther, with your statements of focusing on climate, health, oceans, maybe also space. Yeah, I agree with you. It's the big global issues that can and have the potential to unite us. At the same time, as someone who has worked on oceans for a number of years, I must say the logic of the last frontier, pushing the last frontier, has in the history, it has indeed brought us together to invest and come together, design UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It has worked, but it has gone hand in hand with a big battle of, do we colonize the space out there, the space behind the last frontier, or do we actually do that in a rule-based approach? And I think, in that moment where it's really about defending a rule-based international order versus a deal-based political tribalism, as you called it, Aaron, it will be crucial to ensure that whatever last frontier we define and identify to bring us together, we do it in a rule-based manner. Thanks.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Maybe just one quick point before we go to our friends and colleagues in Italy. First off, I noticed the button that you were wearing. Very cool. That button is actually the SDG button, which directly tied into Elizabeth's thing. And we didn't plan that, by the way. We didn't describe what we were going to wear to this, but that was great. Nice to see. And just maybe a point about the rules-based international order. We talk about the RBO, rules-based international order. The whole point is it creates predictability. And I think we agree that predictability is a good thing. And I think we're living in a moment that seems unpredictable. And a lack of predictability, a lack of certainty is scary. Business doesn't like it. People don't like it. Governments don't like it. So the whole point of the RBO is to create some sort of baseline level of understanding of literally the rules of the road, so that we don't have people breaking the speed limits and driving all over the place. That being said, let's go to my friend in Italy, Antonio Villafranca. He is the Vice President for Research at ISPI. Antonio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be among so many friends and colleagues. So, Aaron, you asked me to define what are the top priorities and pressing challenges today. So, very bluntly, the thing which came up to my mind was, of course, the degree of disruptions brought about by Trump. There is no other way to go around it. And how to tackle this level of disruption at the G7 level in 3 major fields which are important for the G7. The first one was mentioned by Anna-Katharina, is the effect on security, and particularly on NATO and Ukraine. As Anna-Katharina said, we are doing our homeworks in Europe, not something that we really wanted to do like all the students. We don't love them. Still, it's impressive what the European Union is planning to do, announcing this increase in military spending, total amount between, the European effort and the national efforts being around 800 billion euros, which is which is really impressive. Well, this, in any case, gives at least some leverage vis-a-vis Trump. He has been asking, and frankly speaking, also, Obama kept asking it, to increase, military spending in NATO members and the EU. Now, we should reach the 3% of GDP in military spending. So it means that we are basically obeying to the request or to the diktat, as you wish, by President Trump. We are going to do it. So it means that we now should also ask to have a role in the negotiation on Ukraine, and in particular, of course, on ensuring security for what remains what will remain of Ukraine. And this is something that in the G7 should be done, even because don't forget that the G7 over the last 3 years before Trump, it was 80% about Ukraine. The focus of the political leaders of the G7, 80% was basically on Ukraine. The second point is trade. Tomorrow is the big day. Tomorrow, or today, basically, Trump should unveil the new tariffs. We will see if they will be at 20%, 25%, which sectors will be hit. But basically what it means that if you consider the average tariff of the United States in 2018, before the first mandate of Trump, they were 1.7%. Now, with this 25% tariff, the average would be at around 13%. It's almost, 13%. So it's really an incredible hit. So what to do at the G7 level? Well, first we should negotiate with Trump, and also remind Trump that it's true that, for instance, Europe has a huge trade surplus, but we have a deficit when it comes to services with providers based in the United States. So there is room for negotiation also on that. Of course, I'm not suggesting to have a war on a tariff war on services. Still, there is room for that. Last but not least, what Elizabeth said, which is really an awful situation, which is development aid. Just a few days to remind you, Trump is ending USAID, which means ending 65% of US official development assistance. If we put together G7 and the EU, we provide altogether 70% of world's development aids. Now these aids have been cut, of course, in the United States, but not only, frankly speaking, in the United States. If you take France, they cut it. If you take Great Britain, last month, the Minister for Development had to resign because they cut by 1/3 the budget he had. So this to give an idea of what is going on. And don't forget that the G7 before the Ukraine war was mostly about development aid. It was one key feature left to the G7 as opposite to the G20, for instance. And again, my inviting is for the G6 countries to find common ground, of course, with the United States at least on these three topics, to find at least the least minimum denominator among the United States and the G6, and for the G6 to stay true to their values, to free trade. Deepening our ties when there is somebody who is opting for something else. Thank you,
Antonio, for that, and for reminding us that we're having a conversation about international cooperation where there's wars going on right now. So it's a very difficult backdrop to have that conversation against, especially linking the previous discussion about the rules-based international order. Like, the main rule of the rules-based international order is sovereignty, and you cannot threaten or use force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state, period. That is the most important one, and we've got a couple of breaches of that. So thank you for that, Antonio. Next up, we've got Ettore Greco, who is the Executive Vice President of IAI. And maybe just a quick word about our Italian friends. They did a really amazing job hosting the T7 last year, so you left big shoes to fill, gentlemen. Ettore, over to you.
So hi, everyone, and many thanks for the invitation. It's really a great opportunity to share views and perspective with such group of experts and good friends. I think the list of most pressing challenges that we have been invited to identify is certainly not short, since we have witnessed an acceleration of several disrupting and destabilizing processes. But the problem is that in parallel, the opportunities and room for cooperation seem to have dramatically shrunk as a result, especially of the new policies undertaken by the Trump administration. Alignments are rapidly changing. The viability and sustainability of old alliances and partnerships are now in doubt. Therefore, I think in addition to the list of priority, we need to discuss what forums and organizations like the G7 can realistically do in this more conflictual, much less predictable environment. Consensus building within G7 on key elements, its traditional pillars, such as domains such as trade, climate, and development aid, as we already said, has become extremely difficult. Even in sectors in which the G7 under Italy's presidency made significant progress, new divergences have emerged, and the prospect to make further progress in those sectors appear rather remote. Let me, however, mention 3 areas that would deserve particular attention and can perhaps still discuss fruitfully within the G7. One is AI regulation. The code of conduct adopted by the G7 is a flexible and voluntary instrument, and the implementation phase opened during the Italian presidency could be perhaps further developed despite the deregulation drive set in motion by the Trump administration, because there could be a common interest in building or preserving a minimum body of common rules. Dialogue with China is also underway in this field. The second area is global health, has been already mentioned. The US withdrawal from the WHO and the dramatic cuts in development aid is likely to have a dramatic impact, especially in Africa, on, for instance, HIV prevention and treatment and the fight against malaria. However, the risk of new pandemics is widely perceived as incumbent, so an attempt should be made within or outside even the G7 to at least safeguard the remaining 8 programs for the health sector and safeguard specifically the funds needed against global health risks. A third area is food security, which was indeed one of the focuses of the Apulia Declaration under the Italian presidency. The Food Systems Initiative launched during the last G7 summit could be effectively supported by G7 public development banks and DFI. I think, generally speaking, this is could be a very useful program of assistance that can have good results if adequately supported in financial terms. A final remark to just note that could be a fruitful convergence of efforts between G7 and G20 on all of these 3 cooperation avenues. Generally speaking, I would like to echo what has already been said so far about the importance of establishing deeper links between the 2 forums, G7 and G20. So I'll stop here, and I look very much forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the link between the G7 and the G20, I think, is of paramount importance for many of the reasons that we discussed. And I also think it was really thoughtful to have the T20 and T20 and T7 working together as well too. Very fine points. Last, we've got Marc Hecker. Marc is the Deputy Director of IFPRI in France. Marc, bonjour. J'espère que tout allait bien, and I'm doing Duolingo. I've done it every day for 200 years, so welcome.
Bonjour. Many thanks to CIGI for hosting T7 and for inviting me. The problem when you're the 10th speaker is that almost everything that you wanted to say has already been said. But let me start with an historical anecdote. The upcoming G7 summit is actually presented as the 50th G7 anniversary summit. However, the summit that took place in France 50 years ago, in 1975, only convened 6 members. It's only the year after, in 1976, that Canada joined the group that became the G7. In October 1975, US President Gerald Ford wrote a letter to French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing to convince him to let Canada join the group. And I highly recommend that you read this letter in which President Ford praised Canada. When you read it and compare it to today's very tense relation between the US and Canada, you realize that we are living in a really different and new era. The current geopolitical situation is indeed very challenging with regards to international cooperation. In Europe, the degradation of the geopolitical environment is felt strongly. Russia, as you know, was removed from G8 in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Then came the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the return of full-blown war in Europe. And now in 2025, given the narrative and the acts of the Trump administration towards European countries, it seems relevant to ask if the US is still an ally. Speaking about international cooperation from the capital of France, one thinks about the Paris Agreement on climate change that was adopted 10 years ago and that the Trump administration decided to leave. One also thinks about UNESCO, whose headquarters is in Paris. You probably remember that the US left UNESCO during the first Trump administration, came back during the Biden administration, and Donald Trump recently announced a review to decide if the US should leave again. The OECD is also based in Paris. The Trump administration recently withdrew the US from the Global Tax Agreement on multinational profits. Despite this challenging environment, we should continue our efforts to foster international cooperation. Let me very briefly mention 3 points. First, consensus can still be reached on certain topics among traditional allies or partners. For instance, the necessity to fight against narcotics and terrorism is quite consensual among G7 members. Second, on topics that are less consensual, we should not aim for the lowest common denominator. It may be more efficient to work in smaller coalitions of the willing. And third, as many other speakers have already said, international cooperation is not only among state actors. The non-state variations of G7, the so-called engagement groups, are equally important. T7 is one of them, but we should also mention B7 for businesses, C7 for civil society organizations, S7 for science, etc. So we shall not surrender to gloom, and we shall try to be even more active and creative in non-state formats like this one. Over to you, Aaron.
Well, that's an excellent note to end on for our break. We shall not surrender to gloom. And I think there's a lot of cause for concern. I think we've identified a number of trend lines that are striking and problematic. But I think the universal underlying thread of both the first panel and this one is that we don't have a choice. We got to cooperate, or this is existential, especially for many of the most global and pressing challenges. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. For those of you tuning in virtually, good chance to get up and stretch your legs. But also, please feel free to add your questions, because we do want to make this interactive. And so add your questions, and through the magic of the internet, the wonderful staff here at CIGI will push them to my tablet, and then I'll be able to ask this distinguished panel your questions. And likewise, for those of you in the room, we're going to be having a discussion, so it's not just a stand and deliver. So a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back for our lightning round and question and answers. See you in 10 minutes. Welcome back to my esteemed colleagues from all around the world. I would just maybe say that here in Waterloo, and I know you can't see the auditorium, this is the best behaved group that we've ever had. We took a break. I said 10 minutes. They're all back in their chairs, ready to go, which almost never happens. So we had panelists that were on time. We have attendees that are on time. This is great. And so and it's good, because we've got a lot of challenges to deal with. So now we're kind of at the rapid fire stage of the game. I've got some questions from the virtual audience. Some of the people here in the audience in Waterloo would like to ask some questions. So I'm going to open it up, and then I'm going to a question from the virtual audience, and then I'm going to go to the room for a question kind of viva voce. So the question that came in was about the implications for big tech and their corporate valuations if the WTO rulebook is torn up, and also, I guess, maybe the associated implications for intellectual property behind that. So the issue is, going back to what we were saying about the rules-based international order, there's a reason that we have it, right? It created predictability, it created stability, and it was kind of a rising tide, all boats, and now we're seeing pressure on that. So this particular question was, if the rules are torn up, wouldn't that hurt U.S. companies that are dominant? Wouldn't that hurt U.S. big pharma? Wouldn't that hurt these tech companies? And wouldn't that act as a brake to kind of curtail U.S. unilateralism in this area? So if you want to take a shot at that question, just put your hand up so we know who to go to. Esther, while we have some dead air here, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe I'll turn to you.
Thank you. Though I'll say I'm not directly my area of specialty, but there is this question of that rule. The rule international rules-based order does create predictability and does create stability, and we have benefited, I think, by and large, in uneven over the past since I break power, but we say with some benefit there. I do think, however, that one of the questions I think many of our societies, including my own, is facing is how to deal with huge change. And the sense that the existing rules no longer work for everybody in the society. Now, so I think that's pushed the arrival of extremes in multiple polities, and that may not be the right answer, but I think the fact that our publics are certainly reaching for answers that were really not on the table 30 years ago does tell us that the stability that even our existing systems provided was under strain. And for example, AI, so forth. I mean, if you pick up one of our local newspapers today, you'll see an article which says, that knowledge-based work, which we're all engaged, is further challenged by AI. And what does that look like? And so some of the disruptions in our economy do exist. So I think that some of the leaders we see are calling to attention to the fact that our existing structures are no longer delivering. The question is what answer we seek out, and to what extent we defend liberal democracy while we're trying to deal with these profound changes. Thank you.
Okay, that was you got the ball rolling here. Antonio, please.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Well, what is the opposite to a rule-based society, a rule-based world? The opposite is a jungle. It's a jungle where the law of the strongest prevail. The strongest be, of course, the strongest countries, but also the strongest companies. So the impact of the lack of common rules is first on the power distribution among countries, because, of course, it favors big countries, powerful countries, but also in the private sector, it favors multinationals. It favors big companies. So there is a huge impact in terms of inequalities, in terms of lack of competitiveness when we put to the test and we basically destroy a rule-based society.
In realism, right, as I would say. We'll go to Christian and then Tetsushi.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important question, and but I think first thing we should have to look at is what is the rule-based order. I think that's an abstract term, and rule-based order is somehow gained by, say, the common history we have within the given, say, global system of institutional design. And of course, if we now lose that rule-based order, we will all suffer. But we should really think about what is the rule-based order for the future. I do not strongly believe that the rule-based order right now we have within the institutional design of global forces is really a fair one, especially if looking to the global south. So I think we should not just look from our view to that, but we should really think about what is a rule-based new global order which really delivers for all.
Yeah, it's a very fair point, and also being specific about what we're talking about, because the way it actually works is most international law works most of the time, right? If you send a letter internationally, it's going to get to where it's going, right? You're not worried about two ships running into each other on the high seas or two planes knocking into each other, and that's all international law. Most international law is actually kind of boring, and it just does what we need it to do. But this is the stuff of high politics now, right? And there's pressures on this. Tetsushi, please. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So if the more and more rules are broken up, then I think the think tanks will be more and more busy in the coordinating and the cooperating. Yeah, because if rules are there, then the kind of naturally, each country's leaders can expect other country will comply the rule. But if there is no rule, then they are really playing without knowing the other country's responses, and then randomly propose something, and then this leader may eventually have to back down the initial proposal and then change the policy, and then this leader will lose the kind of support from the domestic voters. So the think tanks have to search the other countries' responses and then find out the best policy for their own country's leaders. But to know the other countries' responses, the think tanks must know which think tanks in other countries are reliable. So in that sense, they need to communicate continuously with other countries' think tanks. So in this sense, the think tanks will be more and more busy and busier, and then they have to cooperate more. And we are now entering that kind of situation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're going to turn to Elizabeth next. But I would just say, and I don't say this facetiously, but think tanks have an advantage. None of us got any votes in the last election, right? And it means it creates space, it creates distance. We are not subject to the ups and downs of the political cycle, because if we were, we're in Canada right now, there's an election going on, all we'd be talking about is housing. All we would be talking about is the price of housing. Obviously, the world is much bigger than that, and we're not in the thrust and parry of day-to-day policy development and policy advice, because people in government, believe me when I tell you this, they're smart, they're tenacious, they're hardworking, and they are swamped. And we've got the advantage of sitting back a little bit from it. So, Elizabeth, over to you.
Yeah, we also have to face the challenge, Aaron, of the fact that that think tanks are often in this environment also thought as being the experts who don't know much. What was that famous thing during the Brexit elections that Michael Gove said about experts? I can't remember now. But anyway, but I think you're right. I just wanted to make 2 points on the rules-based order. I think it is important to note, as Christian said, that the current rules-based order, as it is in dire need of reform, that it hasn't worked, or parts of it haven't worked for large parts of the world. And certainly when you're sitting in conversations among developing economies, among the global south, there is a real emphasis on the need to change the rules, to make them fairer, etc., etc. And sometimes it sort of borders on throwing everything out and starting anew. And my caution there, of course, is that we need to be really clear about what we need to reform and what we need to throw out. We have to be very careful about, we need to reflect on the kinds of values that we want to keep, because I don't think everything in the current order is up for renewal or reform, or certainly for throwing out, for a revolution. But sometimes we actually forget the issue, the importance of values in a rules-based order. And we do that at our peril. And I'm talking here about about reflecting on the conversations we have in the global south, that not everything in the liberal international order that we know today is actually bad for us. It actually, a lot of it underpins some of the values that we in our own countries have embraced and identified. And we need to be very careful about what we throw out and what we keep.
Amazing. Good point. Anna-Katharina, and then we're going to go to the audience here at CIGI for the next question.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I mean, obviously, there's a risk of us starting to have a conversation amongst ourselves here. And I just want to mention that I think there's quite an agreement on the rule-based order is much needed and is especially needed for all those countries who do not belong to the 3 biggest nations in the world. And at the same time, there is a need to reform it. Maybe we can have, as part of this conversation, a bit of a conversation on in which areas do these reforms where are they especially needed, and which ones do we need to prioritize? Because what we see at the moment is the throwing out of the, what do you say, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah, I mean, we see substantially more throwing out of the window than a constructive reform here, and that is very risky. It's very risky for most countries that most of us actually represent or stand for and live in. So which are the priorities? Which areas need reform, and in which order maybe? I think that would be a really useful conversation to have. Thanks.
It's a very, very fair point, because if you focus on everything, you focus by definition then on nothing. And this is an area where focus, sustained attention, expertise, political will, and a can-do attitude are going to be required. So I do want to come back to that point. But let's turn to the audience here at CIGI. The advantage you have of putting your hand up first is that you get to speak into a microphone box. So who wants to take the first question? We got one up there, please. And just if you wouldn't mind, I know who you are. Just introduce yourself to our panelists.
Thank you, Aaron. Patricia Fuller with ISD. So I'd like to ask, perhaps especially to the panelists who are from the Global South, what potential do you see for leadership on this question of reforming and saving the rules-based order from governments in the Global South, given that it seems at this point that the scope for leadership, certainly from some quarters that built this order, may not be there. So, and kind of going to the last point about let's be specific. So if we think about, for example, trade rules, like, do you see scope for the countries in the G20 from the Global South to be coming forward and saying, yeah, this is how we need to reform this and drive that effort? Or if not, where does that leadership come from? Thanks.
It's a very fine question. Who would like to go first on that? Luciana, you didn't go in the last round. Did you want to come in on that?
Yes. I say there is a lot of discussion about it in the Global South. You have the G20, you have the BRICS going on, and we have also the other discussions going. But I think that in fact what Elizabeth and brought might be the platform for this discussion. I think we should bring this topic as an important topic for thinking of new, consistent, high quality coordination advice. Which parts of the rules are we going to put forward? Which part are going to reform? Which part is not going to work anyway in this new discussion between the Global South and the North? If you do this in the Global South, you can put some parts of the discussion forward, but we need to do this as think tanks together. So building a platform where you can bring the Global South to the discussion with the countries from the G7 that are part of the G20 also is important. So I think our leaderships in the Global South is discussing this. They are thinking of the ways to going through, but the debate between the Global South and the Global North must go on for this to be effective.
Thank you. Next we have Bambang.
Okay. I think this is the very crucial time for both T7 and T20 to take the leadership in the think tank, in the global think tank community, to come up with the answer to your question. Because I think think tank needs to find out, at least needs to reduce the gap that now exists between the so-called developed economy represented by the G7 and basically Global South. And when we trying to identify the gap, then I believe we might find the solution who should lead and what kind of leadership that a Global South really needs. So far, what I have in mind, if the global multilateralism can work, that must be the ideal. So we can restore, for example, in the trade issue, we can restore or revitalize the role of WTO because it's there and it has been determined as the so-called the leader in the community of the free trade. But then, if we cannot find the solution through global multilateralism, maybe regional multilateralism could be one of the solution. And of course, when we mention by regional, it doesn't have to be only Asia, Africa, South America, separately, but it can be like regional in terms of the global South. Thank you.
Yeah, regional multilateralism works all over the place except for Canada because we live right beside the United States. But Elizabeth, please.
I think the first point to make is that clearly there isn't necessarily sufficient consensus even within the global South about the kinds of reforms or the kind of system that one would want to craft in the next phase. So I think that's important. Even within the BRICS, I think there are different positions. Some have more hardcore views and say on trade, others less so. So that we need to sort of also within the global South work on that. But I think, in terms of your question, Patricia, on potential for leadership, certainly in some areas, I would argue that countries from the developing world have put out their ideas, not necessarily to reform the system wholesale, but have certainly put on the table ideas to improve aspects of it, or to make things a little bit more equitable, even if they're not necessarily permanent. And here are just a couple of examples. I know South Africa and India tend to be difficult countries to engage with in the WTO on particular aspects. But for example, in COVID, they worked together to push for a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights around medical equipment and also on vaccines. I mean, it didn't go very far, but that was one area. So there is some willingness to, and some ideas on the table, not necessarily fully developed innovations around what a new system might look like. But there is some, there are some ideas on the table that have come from the developing world. The other one in the international financial architecture is the proposal that came from the Inter-American Development Bank and the Africa Development Bank around using SDR, special drawing rights, rechanneling them into these regional banks to be able to leverage 4-to-1, and so on. So there are these initiatives to sort of try to move forward on some reforms, but there's certainly, I think it's really difficult to get a large majority of developing countries of global South, given their disparities in size, wealth, political societies, economic frameworks, to actually necessarily agree on a common way forward. But there are areas where I think some of this can begin to emerge.
Yeah, I appreciate that because we use global North, global South as a shorthand, and as though they're monolithic and they act with one common mind or understanding, and nothing could be further from the truth. Thank you for I guess the word of caution. It's I think a really good point. Marc, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. The question was addressed to representatives of the global South, and France is not a representative of the global South yet. But I wanted to react to, even though you may remember that 2 years ago, Emmanuel Macron proposed to take part in a BRICS summit in South Africa. But at the end, it did not happen. No, but more seriously, I just wanted to react to what Elizabeth said before. The whole purpose of a rules-based order is actually to allow countries that do not share the same values and interests to cooperate without going to war. So it's true that values are important, but the core of this order is to allow countries that do not share these values to live together, basically. So the whole question now is what happens when some of the most powerful actors and countries do not want to abide by these rules. What's the answer? I mean, when Russia invades Ukraine, when the US do what they do currently, what should be the reaction of the other countries, of the other actors? And currently for Europe, the whole question is, can we stick together? Because we're stronger together. And I guess that this question of being more united can be addressed broader than to Europe and include also some countries of the global South. Over to you, Aaron.
Actually, we're going to go to Ettore, please. Ettore.
So thanks. Trump said that Europe was born to screw the US. This is the type of reasoning and argument that the current various, of course, representative of the Trump administration is developing. And this is the main element to be considered. At the moment, if you have very powerful countries, they are not accepting the idea of seed powers, to share powers, try to create a system of rules and institution. This is a big problem because, of course, this creates a very unstable world and necessarily reaction for the other that give rise to clearly tensions and contestations and very uncertain situation in terms of relations and possible alignments. So this is the general consideration from which I would move, because we are in a situation where the strongest country is contesting the system, its rule and institution. The institutions are very important. The US is withdrawing from many important bodies, and so we risk losing very important instruments to enforce the rules. It's not only a problem of rules, the problem of having two instruments to make cooperation effective. Now I think we are in a situation where it's really difficult to see how we can restart a meaningful reform process of the institution. We have lost a lot of opportunities in the past. If you see the agenda of the G7 itself, some years ago, there were many possible avenues and the idea that actually these reforms could be implemented. Many attempts were made in the past that progressively this effort faded away. So we are now confronted this situation after having failed to make this process advancing. And this is why, and it has been stressed, the situation now is so difficult to manage. In this situation, I think, and this point has been already made, that probably we will witness an increasing trend towards regionalization, regional agreements, plurilateral agreement within the organization or outside them, coalition with the willing. This is almost inevitable. So our task as think tanks could be to consider how those initiatives can be productive, can be positive, can be themselves capable of producing positive results in terms of cooperation, not being, of course, part of a general confrontational trend. So, concerning specifically the WTO, I think at the moment we don't see a real prospect of restarting any serious attempt at reforming, but we should think hard about the need to at least preserve it as a ultimate, very important civil settlement mechanism, although at the moment it's largely paralyzed, but this is an important asset to preserve.
Thank you for that, Ettore. And Anna-Katharina, I'm going to come to you, but I'd like to. There's actually a really nifty question that came in from online, so I'm going to pose this question to you. And this is an old moderator trick. You can ignore it and answer the one that you wanted to answer. You can answer this one. So it's up to you. But I just wanted to get it out there because it's an interesting thought that I did not have in our discussion so far. So the question is, as state actors face systemic crises, can the UN work with scientific and professional communities, as it did with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to advance practical global architecture for digital finance and data cooperation that can enable progress toward the SDGs, even if formal treaties lag? And so this is that idea of, like, can we do the the meaningful, technical, kind of more boring work to advance this and stay out of the high politics. Like, I don't know how plumbing works, but I know that if I turn the hot tap on, hot water will come out. If I turn the cold tap on, cold water will come out. I don't need to know the entire architecture of it. Like, that is complicated. It is technical. You can't have a gut feeling about it. Either you know what you're talking about or you don't. So is there scope to advance this agenda at the technical level? Over to you, Anna-Katharina.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Maybe just on that question, I mean, I would say to some degree, yes, to some degree, but only, to a limited degree. And in the Pact for the Future, there was the Global Digital Pact. It's called something similar as that. It was agreed on last September in New York as part of the Pact for the Future and as part of the Summit for the Future. So that intention to use the strength of the United Nations to advance AI and digital regulation is there. But I think it's a big but, and the developments also with regards to some of the actors in Silicon Valley over the past months put that but, even or sort of underline that but, and out of a European perspective, it's in many ways some of the dissents between Europe and some of the tech giants in Silicon Valley, and also the political representatives in Washington right now, has a lot to do with exactly that topic of regulating the digital realm, basically. But I did want to, if I still may, Aaron, I did want to touch up on Professor Bambang's point on regional multilateralism. And I mean, out of European perspective, that's not really multilateralism, but it's building the regional strength and being united as Europe, being united as ASEAN, being united as the African Union, for instance. While of course each of these constructs differ, legally speaking, differ in terms of how they are organized, etc. But yeah, out of a European perspective, that is at the moment the way to go. Yeah, in order to actually act as a balancing act, basically, towards the US, but also towards other big and powerful players. Is that easy? No, of course not. I mean, to be united as Europe has been a difficult exercise since the European Union exists, but it also has been the biggest peace project that the world has ever seen. Yeah, one also has to underline that. And having said that, I think definitely it is the way to go, because it is, as said, it has brought us peace for a very long time in Europe. And nevertheless, what does that then mean for the cooperation between regional organizations? Yeah? Are we thinking then about strengthening bilateral and trilateral cooperations? So EU and AU, EU and ASEAN, is that the future that we are interested in? To some degree, yes, definitely, that's a way to go, but it cannot be all. Yeah, it cannot be all. There has to be a multilateral level where the sovereignty of nation states is playing out, and where 193 nation states come together and are able to take decisions together. So it's not an either or, but it's both. Yeah, I think that's really important to invest into both levels. Strengthening the regional level, yes, strengthening the bilateral, trilateral approaches between regions, but also investing into the multilateral level, even though not everyone agrees to it.
And I only wish we had a former Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations on this panel. Oh, wait, we do, Esther. I'd like to come to you on any or all of the above, but I'm really interested in that technical architecture question. Is there any room there? But in any order you wish, please.
Thank you. So first, I would say that yes, that the role of regional organizations and regional clusters and other groupings does take on increased importance. I think it's interesting to see the number of people who've talked about the importance of regional cooperation. And indeed, if you think about the global system, that there's always been a space for regional cooperation, but I think what we're seeing now is deeper, more profound types of cooperation. We don't necessarily need to see it as opposed to global, but as several different levels of building blocks for cooperation. The other I would flag is of course cooperation of subsets that are not geographically co-located, but have shared interests. Indeed, the G7, G20 fall into this category. And to say that I'd want to make sure we're including these all of these different types of groupings in our ability to try to create structures that respond to needs of people on different issues. The other thing I would say is that there is still a role for fundamental global institutions. And I do think we still need a framework for having global institutions. We will still need to have a place to where in a sense everybody is a member. That's not going to be smooth. It's never going to be smooth. Part of the definition is because of the complexity of the issues. That's the case. But and that's why in my points I was trying to raise the idea of what issues have to be dealt with in the global body. I'd also note that indeed one of the ways to also inject some capacity and innovation also is careful, well thought out inclusion of the private sector on the space work that we're doing. We're looking at where the private sector can contribute, and that includes companies. It also includes universities and other experts as well that need to be part of creating the systems for the new structures that weren't thought of in 1945, including space, AI, and other areas. So I've not given up on the global system. It is certainly under strain. It will continue to be so. But I think there are certain structures that we can try to maintain, and it should be a sense of that the local, regional, and international global organizations are connected to each other, and that we are, in a sense, trying to support one overall system, albeit in different manifestations.
Thank you. I want to grab one last question from the audience here in Waterloo, and then I'm going to turn to the panel for a brief closing set of remarks. And Tetsushi, we're going to come to you first, and actually we'll run the order that we came in on. So one last question from the audience here. Please, yeah, up front.
Hi there, my name is Gabrielle Leaks-Kotick. I'm here with the Y7 delegation, and this is Tam. She's our EDI coordinator. So the question we wanted to ask is in context of youth engagement in peace and security. So we're seeing younger individuals placed in positions of influence, such as running the Department of Government Efficiency in the United States. However, youth negotiators in international security discussions often face skepticism. What critical perspectives or tools are we in need of, and where are we being overlooked? How can we strengthen our role in shaping security policies to ensure we are not just symbolic participants?
Okay, so there's a lot. There's like a PhD dissertation in that question. Okay, and we only have 1 minute, so we'll do a double barrel here. So I think the question was really about youth engagement and peace and security, and this actually matters because the decisions that we're making right now aren't going to affect us. The people that bear the brunt of bad decisions now are our kids, and so the question is about youth engagement in peace and security. But I'm going to rephrase it somewhat differently and say, you have an engaged audience here in Waterloo. You've got a global audience that's tuned in from around the world. What is the one thing that you want to leave this audience with? What is the one thing that you want them to remember from your remarks? Tetsushi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. So yeah, it's a wonderful point because young people, more strongly need hope, peace, right? And so let them, work more, and let us empower those youth to work on the peace. And then in the same vein, the small countries, small states, and the middle powers need the rule-based global governance more. So in addition to the regional cooperation. I'd like to point out the cooperation among middle power countries and small state, and likewise about the peace. Let us empower the youth.
Thank you very much for that. Your students are going to be well served when you go back to the classroom, sir. Bambang, same question to you. What's the one thing you want to leave this audience with?
Yeah, I think for the youth, UN has produced, I think, one of the so-called a masterpiece in the development, and we know everybody talking about the SDG, and SDG already covered the goals that basically, comprising all the youths want in the future. But then we know that the implementation of SDG has been stumbled with all the the restriction. So I believe this is the time for the think tank to give the recommendation and inputs for the UN especially. So I believe most ideally UN and MDB's Multilateral Development Bank could cooperate well in trying to make the best to achieve the SDG. But then we know that to some extent UN and MDBs are also influenced by few countries. Then I believe with the spirit of trying to revive the global multilateralism, I think the role of both UN and MDBs needs to be strengthened so we can come back to the to the original idea of achieving SDGs 2030.
Thank you. Luciana, please.
I think that we know that we're not a homogeneous group, that we have our differences, but we could come up with some good ideas along the way of our working together. So I think that we should really strengthen our platform of action, thinking about not only these policy briefs, but thinking about some concrete topics for us to go on together and put on the consensus that we need for this multilateralism or these clubs that we have as G20, BRICS, and other things. But this should not be only done by think tanks. We should do this in think tanks and bring this to a discussion with civil society and non-state actors, because that's the way for us to establish some knowledge about this process and some ideas that could really attach to the real world in our consensus. So I think we should strengthen these links and go on for these processes that we're building, even though that the times are not quite in favor of it.
Thank you. Elizabeth, over to you.
So I'll put on my advocacy hat in terms of the youth question and say, you've got to make the space. Sometimes the space isn't ceded to you. You actually got to make the space. And I think it's really about creating a greater push and awareness of the need to engage the youth. And I think in South Africa, in terms of some of the discussions around peace and security, that is beginning to happen. But let me just make the following point. I think cooperation is essential to secure our future generations. I mean, that is critical, and that I think all of us have a vested interest in. And in terms of what Luciana also said, I think those platforms of engagement are so critical, and ideas being put on the table, even if the time is not yet ripe for these ideas to actually come to fruition and to come to reality. And I think we must also remember that with a lot of these international institutions that were established over time, people joined, in some instances, much later. And so as we are rethinking new institutions and we're recognizing that there are some challenges to bringing everybody on board, we may need to make the process move and others may join later. But it is critical for securing future generations and the planet.
Thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. Maybe just to riff off that one point about youth inclusion in these conversations, showing up is a big part of it, and taking space and being part of these conversations. There's a phenomenon in experimentation. The simple act of being observed actually changes the outcome of the experiment. So being part of that process, I think, goes a long way. Esther, over to you.
I'd like to put in a word again for intergenerational cooperation, that indeed that both harnessing the energy of youth who also are going to be living with the consequences of whether it's climate change or loss of liberties for decades to come, but also the wisdom that's also found in multiple ages about what common humanity looks like. And those are enduring values. And so I think the partnership across generations, for whether it's people who remember the civil rights movements or people who fought for the environmental movements, or people who are also creating new technological change, I think we need to find those partnerships that all come back to our common humanity.
Love it. Christian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I would say, yeah, let's really check multiple new formats. I think check clubs, check other issues, flexible governance, coalitions of the willing. I think we have to do it quick, so we should not wait too long. On the other hand, and this is my closing remark, there is a nice remark from the philosopher Imre Lakatos. He has once said, why jumping out of the window when you can use an elevator? And this is what we would like to do. So not being too slow, but not jump out of the window, also take caution.
Okay, yeah, good advice. Don't jump out windows. Anna-Katharina, please.
Yeah, thanks. Since years we've been discussing that we are seeing a multipolar world emerging. No, that's an empirical assessment of fact, so to say. And that the real question really is this a multipolar world that stays united, that it stays connected by a universal system, a multilateral system that brings us together to address joint challenges jointly? Or whether we see this multipolar world actually drifting apart, and we actually see not multiple poles, but multiple orders, multiple systems of ordering emerging. And then, of course, the question is, do these multiple differing systems of ordering the world cooperate in a constructive manner, or do they rather drift into destructive competition? And in the past months, I think we have seen quite a few signs of these competing systems of ordering the world emerging. And of course, the message here is, let's strengthen the multilateral system. Let's keep us jointly together. Multipolar world, yes, I think that has a lot of potential to create a better, a more equal world, but only if we actually stay connected through a multilateral system that enables us to engage in the fight we need, in the democratic fight in many ways, the open fight and contestation over real issues, but in a peaceful manner. Now, on the youth question, if I may, Aaron, I just want to sort of draw on my German and my Australian family and refer to John Farnham, You're the Voice. It's of course a song that resonated in East and West Germany during reunification substantially. And I think the point is a little bit what, as Elizabeth said, I mean, intelligence and decency, or an interest in actually building a better future, that is not age-specific, obviously. But political power and economic power has a tendency to be a bit more age-specific. And that creates a lopsidedness. And it means you need to create the space and make yourself be seen and heard. Don't wait too long to be given the seat.
Antonio, how's ISPI going to fix all this? But we're also at time, so you got 30 seconds.
Very quickly. My last message is, don't take for granted, some narratives that we used just a few months ago. For instance, this division between the global north and global south. What about the global north? What about the relations between Europe and the United States today? What is global north? So, as the other speaker said, we should consider cross-cutting among, between the global north and the global south cooperation, including new form of regionalization, which, there is a term to define it, which is plurilateralism among all the ones, of course, who agree upon.
Ettore, please.
So my personal suggestions to young people, and particularly young researchers and students, would be to concentrate their mind and attention particular to so-called global common because we have mentioned several of them, like open space, maritime security, AI, the risk of pandemics. I think the preservation of some of the global common, particularly, for instance, global health security, are for the benefits of the whole humanity. And I think there could be, at a certain point, and increasingly, drives urging and pushing for the for future achievements in terms of the establishment of new instruments and new forms of cooperation. So I think it would be important to look into the actual possibility to create new instruments and new possibilities to do that, because there could be a new wave, a new concrete efforts to do that. So this is an effort. This is, I think, something that is worth undertaking.
Thank you. Marc, final word to you.
Thanks, Aaron. You mentioned in your introduction the tribes, and I've never understood why Y7 is actually a separate entity, why we create a separate tribe. And I think that actually the US7 should be integrated in the other engagement groups, that we should hear more the voice of the young people, and that we should have had actually more young people in this panel as well. So perhaps that for the next editions, and I think that the next year it will be in France, we should integrate the voice of the new generation into the other panels and the other engagement groups.
That's a wonderful point to end on, and I will have 500 days of Duolingo under my belt by then, so I'll be able to moderate in French for you. So I think it falls to me to try and close this conversation off, and I think I'd like to leave off with the last question. And I think there's one common thing that unites people, and it's a promise that if you work hard and live a virtuous life, your kids can have a better and safer life than you. And I'm not convinced that we can make that promise anymore, and certainly not without cooperation. All of the challenges that we've identified all go to that one facet. I think everyone can agree that they want a better life for their kids, and so it's we don't have a choice. We have to cooperate to solve this. This has been a showstopper of a panel. I'd like to thank my colleagues from around the world for their time. I'd like to thank the audience here in Waterloo for such an engaging session. So thank you all.